This is a presentation from Winchester Academy.
Marcia Brennerwood is a professor of geology and environmental studies at Lawrence University, and her list of accomplishments is so long. I've had to highlight a few things in yellow to summarize and, give them a good report for me, okay, that I'm trying to be brief. Dr. Brennerwood is a professor of geology and environmental studies. Her research focuses on physics of earthquake and mountain building, and I assume that has nothing to do with jumping over molehills. Different kind of mountain building. Okay. But her list goes on and on. She did research in the high Arctic, in Norway, and in northern Canada. She's done research in Norway itself, as the mainland Norway, in Scotland, New Zealand, the Lake Superior region. She received her BS in geophysics from the University of Minnesota, and has MS and PhD degrees from the University of Wisconsin. So she's not totally out of the Midwestern crew. She's one of us, I think. So she's the author of two other books, and they are on the table up here. You might want to take a look afterwards. And she is willing to part with them at a discount rate, yes. And I think with that, I'm going to turn things over to Marcia. If I left anything important out, just fill in the blanks, okay?
I haven't tested this mic. Is it working?
Yep.
No. Put it up higher. There.
Better.
Is that better? Yes. Okay. Thank you. It's wonderful to be back at Winchester Academy. I think it's been at least 10 years since I was here, but I've always felt this is, my people. So Terry's right. I'm a native Midwesterner, and I'm going to take us on an exploration of time today. I'm going to start right here in Wisconsin with a childhood memory. For children who grow up in wintry climates, few events in life will ever deliver the same pure joy as a snow day. Time is temporarily repealed, the oppressive schedules of the adult world magically suspended in a concession to the greater authority of nature. I recall one particular snow day when I was growing up in rural Wisconsin in the 1970s. There'd been a ferocious blizzard in the night with heavy snow and high winds that by morning had brought bitter cold. But I couldn't resist going out to survey the transformed world. Trees creaked and groaned as they do when it is especially cold. I spotted a dab of red on a branch and saw that it was a cardinal. I started walking toward it in the heavy snow and was surprised when it didn't move. I got closer still and then realized with both revulsion and fascination that it was frozen on the branch. It was if time itself had been frozen, and I was able to witness something that was normally a blur of motion. Back in the house later that day, I remember heaving our unwieldy world atlas down off the shelf and paging through it. I came to a map of time zones around the world with the globe divided into longitudinal stripes of alternating colors. But there were several places, Antarctica, Outer Mongolia, and one I'd never heard of, Svalbard in the high Arctic, that were colored gray. The legend said that these places had no official time. I was captivated by the idea of remote enclaves that had resisted being shackled by measures of time, no minutes or hours, wholly exempt from the tyranny of a schedule. Was time there frozen like the cardinal on a branch? Or simply flowing, unmetered and unfettered according to a wilder natural rhythm? As it happened, I would end up doing my PhD research in Svalbard, and later spent additional summer field seasons there as a geologist working for the Norwegian Polar Institute. I quickly learned that the no official time designation was nothing as romantic as I had imagined, but instead the result of a long-running political spat between the Norwegians and Russians about whether to use Oslo or Moscow time there. And I began to understand that the place was not timeless, but timeful. When I first arrived there in the 1980s, it still felt like the Pleistocene. The place was still firmly in the grip of the Ice Age. Artifacts from the last few centuries of human activity were strewn sparsely across the vast landscape as if in a poorly curated museum display. There were whale bones scattered across the tundra, remnants from 17th century Dutch blubber rendering stations. There were 18th century Russian graves from the time of Catherine the Great, when exile to Svalbard was a slow death penalty. There were huts built of driftwood by 19th century miners and hunters, with old boots in the corners and rusty tin cans still on the shelves. Somehow, all of these past times, signified by these objects, seemed equally close, all still palpably present. My field research focused on understanding the tectonic evolution of the northernmost part of the Appalachian Caledonian mountain belt. And immersed in that work, in a place so remote from modern life, I began to feel that this 400 million year old event, and the still older rocks recording it, were more proximal in time than the 20th century world. In places like Svalbard, with comparatively little human clutter, it is easy to sense the presence of the past. But everywhere, the natural world is bursting with backstories. The world is made by, or more precisely of, time. And this is what I mean by timefulness, an awareness of the rich natural history that envelops us, a sense that we too live in geologic time and are part of a continuum from the past of the planet into its future. Timefulness is a deliberate counterpoint to timelessness, an unattainable, sterile, and I will argue even dangerous idea. But we live in a time-illiterate society. We'd be shocked if an educated adult had no idea where the continents were on a globe, but don't seem bothered by the fact that few average people have any good sense of the geography of the planet's past. Even though we'll spend our entire lives here, we behave like bad tourists on Earth, enjoying its amenities and ransacking its bounty without ever having noticed that it has its own ancient language and customs. Many of the environmental problems we face have arisen because we collectively lack a sense for the durations of the chapters of Earth's history, the rates of geologic processes like groundwater flow, or the intrinsic timescales of natural phenomena like climate change. In our culture, time denial, or what we might call chronophobia, is rampant and comes in many varieties, arising from different sources. The most obvious and vocal, of course, is young Earth creationism. But it's worth noting that 200 years ago, geology and theology were not at odds. And in fact, the scientific discovery of deep time, to use John OKeefe's evocative phrase, was actually motivated by religious belief. The beginning of modern geology as a discipline is usually traced to an 18th century Scotsman, James Hutton, who was a physician, gentleman farmer, naturalist, and polymath on the fringes of the Edinburgh Enlightenment. He often drank and dined with the likes of the philosopher David Hume, the inventor James Watt, economist Adam Smith, and apparently Ben Franklin even visited him once. As a landowner, Hutton was concerned, for economic reasons, that the large amount of soil he could see was being washed away to the sea every year. As a religious person, a deist, like many Enlightenment thinkers, he was also troubled spiritually by the idea that God would simply allow the earth to be worn steadily away, that at some time in the future, all of the continents would be eroded down to sea level, and the earth would be uninhabitable by humans. His writings suggest that he was actively looking for evidence of some compensatory process of rejuvenation, and he found it late in his life at this rocky promontory off the east coast of Scotland. It's called Sicker Point. And I don't have a pointer here, but I'm going to zoom into the area, it's there, and show a kind of schematic sketch done by a student of mine, and it's actually in my book, of this famous locality called Sicker Point. So what he saw there, and it was an amazing epiphany in the late 1700s to read these rocks this way, was this older sequence of sedimentary rocks which were on end. Clearly something had happened to them, so they're vertical. And then this irregular surface, and then a younger sequence of rocks that was just gently tilted. What he recognized was that surface between the two rock sequences represented the time it would take to erode a mountain belt down, because he recognized those tilted rocks represented the deeply eroded roots of a mountain. This was 150 or more years before plate tectonics explained how mountains even form, but he had the understanding that tilted rocks mean some kind of tectonic event. And what he recognized was essentially deep time in that context. We call that an unconformity. But Hutton made an even greater inductive leap and surmised that the rocks at Sicker Point recorded just one of countless such cycles of uplift and erosion. His 1788 treatise called Theory of the Earth, published the year before he died, famously ends with the sentence, "The result, therefore, of our present enquiry is that we find no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end." So this was a very radical break with the idea that there was 6,000 years or so of Earth's history before the present day. So Hutton gave us deep time, but he wasn't particularly interested in the granular details of what had happened during those vast eons. And until those details began to be filled in, the church apparently didn't feel threatened. Hutton's beautiful idea of an Earth that was infinitely old and continuously regenerating captured the public's imagination in the way that space exploration does in our time. In the upper left there is a depiction of Hutton's unconformity in 1802 that was widely circulated in Britain and the US and ignited public interest in the emerging science of geology. After Hutton's death, Sir Charles Lyell became the most vocal proponent of this new view of time that geology offered. His great 3-volume treatise, Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833, was a widely circulated and immensely popular work. He was a good writer and a virtuosic orator. He went on extended speaking tours on both sides of the Atlantic and packed auditoriums and opera houses even in frontier towns and reached diverse audiences. So this abstract conception of an immensely old Earth does not seem to have raised the hackles of the church. It wasn't really until paleontology began to uncover evidence of extinct creatures and vanished ecosystems, and then of course when Darwin suggested how organisms, including humans, could have evolved through the non-directed process of natural selection, that the church began to see geology as a threat. I want to acknowledge that many other cultures around the world probably did not have the same aversion to deep time and the idea of biological evolution that the Judeo-Christian West has had. But I focus here on the European tradition because that is, in fact, where the modern practice of geology and the scientific calibration of deep time got its start. Anyway, at this point in the early 21st century, geology has been contending with creationists and young earthers for more than 150 years. It's easy to be derisive about young earth thinking, but I do empathize with people who are truly struggling to reconcile religious beliefs with scientific understanding. I occasionally have students who are in this position, and I offer them a variation on an argument made by Descartes in his Meditations on the Nature of Reality. Early in an introductory geology class, one begins to understand that rocks are not nouns, but verbs, records of processes. Tilted layers signify the growth of a mountain belt. Limestone represents the accretion of a coral reef. So I ask students to consider this. Which is more heretical? To accept the idea of an old and evolving Earth set in motion 4.5 billion years ago, whose internally consistent history, a remarkable, awe-inspiring saga, has been worked out little by little over the past 2 centuries by people from many cultures, or a deceitful creator who has planted false clues about the planet's past in every nook and cranny, from fossil beds to zircon crystals whose isotopic ages we might one day determine just to mislead us deliberately. Students must decide for themselves. Apocalypticism is a dangerous offshoot of religiously motivated time denial in which not only the geologic past but also the future are foreshortened. If you think there is no future, then there's no need to conserve or be concerned with climate change. In fact, not using up resources is paradoxically wasteful. But at least young earthers and apocalypticists are completely open about their aversion to time. More insidious forms of time denial are woven into the very fabric of our culture. Our natural existential dread of aging and death has become entangled with vanity through capitalistic messaging in a society obsessed with youth. As a result, we fear and loathe our tininess. Making us afraid of time is big business. Time denial is a multi-billion-dollar industry. At least this product is forthright about being utterly detached from reality. Have you noticed these days we're more often we more often refer to ourselves as consumers rather than citizens, and that doesn't really bother anyone. Citizen implies living somewhere over time in proximity to others with the attendant give and take that requires. Consumer suggests only taking, as if our sole purpose were to devour everything in sight now in the manner of locusts descending on a field of grain. And we are as insatiable as locusts for novelty, the newest smartphone, the just released app, the meme of the moment, the latest elixir of life. We don't notice how quickly all of these age, become old, tired, so 5 minutes ago, because the next ones arrive to take their place before we've had a chance to dwell on that, allowing us to remain pleasantly distracted in a never-ending now. The narcissistic preoccupation with our own creations has led to a mass illusion that we have outgrown the natural world, that we are exempt from geologic rules, and that we now exist outside time. In this country in particular, there's a widely accepted notion, indeed a virtual credo, that free markets represent an almost sacred natural state, that anything that fetters them, including protections for nature itself, which provides the raw goods for the never-ending, never-satisfying economic monster, is unnatural. And while we may scoff at apocalyptic thinking, the opposite view, that we can carry on forever at ever-increasing levels of resource consumption, is equally deluded. In 2016, the novelist Amitav Ghosh published this provocative book of essays, originally written as a series of lectures at the University of Chicago, in which he makes the point that so far, serious literary fiction has failed to address climate change, the central issue of our time. He reminds us that literature has often anticipated and catalyzed revolutions in human society, from ending slavery and colonialism to regulating meatpacking. But, he argues, few serious novelists have yet found a way to write compellingly about impending changes in the natural world. I think that in just the past few years since he published the book, maybe a few serious novelists, Richard Powers, Louise Erdrich, have risen to this challenge. But I think he articulates an important idea, that we in the West have little appetite for stories without individual human protagonists, and that is essential if we are to take action on global environmental challenges. His title has two meanings: the derangement we have caused to nature, and our derangement in our belief that we are outside the narratives of nature. And here is where science, and geology in particular, can help, by doing a better job of telling the remarkable stories of the natural world. Tolstoyan in the number of characters. These come in all genres, some heartwarming, some terrifying, some cryptic, most stranger than fiction. But it must be acknowledged that science itself is culpable for other streams of time denial. In the hierarchy of sciences, it is telling that the pure, that is timeless, eternal ones, physics, but also chemistry, are most esteemed, while biology and geology, which reek of time and history, are by implication impure. There's no Nobel Prize in geology, though there is one in economics. I respect the accomplishments of other sciences. Geology is in fact a highly interdisciplinary field that necessarily draws on the principles and methods of physics, chemistry, and biology. But many environmental problems we face are the result of the failure in the early to middle 20th century to anticipate how new technologies, the internal combustion engine, chemical fertilizers, antibiotics, plastics, would interact over time with complex, evolving natural systems. The scientists and engineers behind these innovations could have used a bit of geologic thinking, some timefulness. An unfortunate reality is that the unintentional consequences of our technologies will almost always outlive our intentional implementation of them. To think geologically is not as much about time itself as the power of time to inexorably alter, entangle, magnify, ramify, and otherwise complicate. But geology, too, as a discipline, has been at fault for failing to put human and planetary timescales in proper perspective. First, for a variety of reasons, geology is a late bloomer. It's a bit embarrassing for us to note that the laws of thermodynamics were worked out in the 19th century, the structure of the atom in the early 20th, but plate tectonics, the way the solid Earth works, was not figured out until 1965. Some of the delay was technological. Earth was just too close and too big to see clearly before that time. But it was also partly due to the myopia and lack of imagination of the majority of geologists in the early to mid-20th century who were too preoccupied with locating coal, oil, and mineral resources to recognize the rather obvious signs that the Earth is a dynamic planet that continuously reconfigures itself. Another ironic reason for public time illiteracy is that in some ways, geologists have been too emphatic about the immense antiquity of the Earth and the slowness of geologic processes as a result of our constant vigilance against young earthers. I'm sure you're all familiar with the 24-hour analogy for geologic time. If the 4.5 billion year history of the Earth were condensed into one day, the idea that we humans just barely make it in the last fraction of a second before midnight. But I think this is a wrong-headed depiction of our place in time. First, it's alienating. It suggests we appeared out of nowhere and denies our deep roots in the evolutionary past. True, we humans in present form are relatively recent arrivals, but our ancestors have been here since the early morning hours. Second, it seems to absolve us from responsibility for our actions. How could anything we've done in the last fraction of a second matter to the Earth? And finally, it's unintentionally apocalyptic. What happens after the clock strikes midnight? It suggests that geologic time ends, that there is no geologic future. Also, Earth is not really so sluggish. It has many tempos, moods, and modes, some too fast for our liking. And there are unfortunate asymmetries in the rates of processes. Evolution is slow, but extinctions can be brutally sudden. Sliding into an ice age is generally gradual, but warming up is often abrupt. Groundwater accumulates over centuries or millennia, but can be depleted in years. Finally, another reason that geologic thinking has not made inroads into public discourse is that geology, frankly, has a PR problem. For many people, it either evokes musty museums, it seems to be about a dim and irrelevant past, or rapacious resource extraction. And there are no rigorous, engaging courses in modern geoscience in most US high schools, so few people are aware of what the discipline is really about. And that's one reason that many geologists, including me, stumble into the field almost by accident. I recall as a first grader being fascinated by Surtsey, a new island formed off the coast of Iceland in the 1960s. In school, we watched a movie showing the spires of steam and hot ash shooting out of the cold North Atlantic. It suggested a secret life force inside the stony-faced Earth that terrified and thrilled me. But no one said people called geologists study such things. And subsequent school years with less than inspirational science teachers drummed out of me any nascent thought of becoming a scientist. As a freshman in college, I signed up for geology almost on a whim. My expectations were low. Everybody called it rocks for jocks. To my surprise, though, I found it was a different kind of science that required a type of whole-brain thinking I hadn't encountered before. It demanded a humanities-like close reading of the texts of the natural world. It involved the rigorous application of physics and chemistry to wild and unruly things like volcanoes and oceans. And above all, it required a vivid but disciplined imagination, the capacity for visualization across great expanses of time and space. And I saw its vast explanatory power. It was nothing less than the etymology of the world. Geology is a strange hybrid of the pragmatic and the philosophical. It's about where to find oil and groundwater, how to protect people from natural hazards, but it's also about deep existential matters. Where do we come from? Why is the Earth the way it is? What factors favor stable, resilient ecosystems and societies? And increasingly, it's as much about the future as the past. An apt metaphor for geologic thinking is that of a palimpsest manuscript. In medieval times, texts were written on parchment, a commodity that required a lot of labor to produce, and so they were often scraped off and then re-inked. But always, vestiges of the earlier text remained beneath the most recent one. Similarly, landscapes have their histories written all over them, scraped by erosion and overwritten many times. Once you become attuned to the earlier scribbles, it's impossible not to see them, and to realize that in our time, too, new versions of the world are constantly being written. I often feel that I don't just live in Wisconsin, but in many Wisconsins. There are the forests, still recovering from 19th century clear-cutting. There are the Great Lakes and mighty rivers that governed ancient trade routes long before Europeans arrived, legacies of the immense ice lobes that flowed down from Canada. There are golden Cambrian sandstones marking the shores of long-vanished seas, and in the north, contorted gneisses that are the surviving roots of Proterozoic mountains. Every place on Earth has similar stories, sprawling, million-generation sagas of stability and upheaval, seas rolling in and rolling out, glaciers advancing and retreating, mountains rising and being erased by erosion. Reconstructing Earth's past from the raw rock record is one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, but but underappreciated because it wasn't done by a solitary genius, but rather built up incrementally by casts of thousands over the last 2 centuries. It's truly astonishing that we've been able to retrieve in so much detail most of Earth's biography, but the geologic timescale is still a work in progress, and there's plenty for future generations of geoscientists to decipher. I recognize that some people feel diminished by geologic time, that humans are made insignificant by it, and I can understand that. But I think it helps to develop some depth of field when talking about time. I once had a math teacher who was fond of saying there are many sizes and shapes of infinity. And while geologic time is not infinite, it is long. Some past events, like the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, happened just the other day. Others say the formation of Pangaea a while ago, and some the origin of life a long time back. It's also useful to adopt the Greek distinction between chronos, raw time, billions and billions of years, and kairos, which is time within a narrative. As one starts knowing Earth's history, and those vast stretches of geologic time are filled with narratives, protagonists, and plot lines, it's no longer alienating. The characters become familiar, the themes resonant. Once we open a few volumes in the Library of Deep Time, the rock record, we can begin to recognize ourselves in the tales of earlier Earthlings. Indeed, I find the idea of a 6,000 or 7,000-year-old Earth with a short, shallow story positively terrifying, while the enveloping presence of so many ancestors with such a rich anthology of life stories to recount is, to me, deeply comforting. So let me describe just one salient lesson from among the many that these ancestors, through the rock archives, have left about how to survive over the long term. So one lesson from the rock record, a little bit of technical detail. And it is, above all, respect and emulate biogeochemical cycles. They are the key to Earth's long-term habitability. So I'm going to unpack that idea. Earth is basically a closed system. Other than a fine rain of comets, micrometeorites, and the occasional dinosaur-killing asteroid, the planet has not acquired any significant new mass since it formed 4.5 billion years ago. Yet the median age of continental surface rocks is only about 500 million years. The oldest ocean crust is 170 million years old. The oceans themselves are refreshed every few millennia. And as Hutton noted, soil is constantly washed to the sea, yet so far hasn't disappeared. This means that everything on the planet is incessantly recycled, reforged, and restocked. Every process has its inverse operation, every flow a compensatory counterflow in an intricate system of checks and balances. It's like an elaborate contradance happening across many different spatial and time scales in which after many rounds, everybody ends up back where they started. In fact, this tendency for infinite repetition and reinvention is the single most important attribute that distinguishes Earth from other planets. It's not simply that the Earth happened to be the right size and distant from the sun, but that it developed habits as a young planet that have kept its surface environment clement for most of the past 4 billion years. And life on Earth got involved in that circular logic very early on. Tyler Volk, who's at New York University, suggested that one way to understand the bio part of any given biogeochemical cycle is through a metric that he calls the cycling ratio. It's the amount of a commodity, say nitrogen, that changes hands, or paws, or cilia in an ecosystem, divided by the amount that exits the system in a given period of time. It's essentially the number of times that that element or molecule is traded between organisms before becoming locked up in sediment or returning to the atmosphere. A resource that's reused many times via transport between organisms, say soil microbes, plants, herbivores, carnivores, scavengers, decomposers, before leaving the biotic system will have a higher cycling ratio than one that is taken in and discarded after a single use. The values of the cycling ratio in nature vary over many orders of magnitude depending on what systems and resources one considers, but cycling ratios are always inversely proportional to the availability of that resource. So the scarcer the resource, the more the biosphere recycles it. So let's briefly consider the biogeochemical cycling of just 2 elements, and don't sweat the details here, but this is just to illustrate that it's complicated. First, nitrogen, essential at the cellular level for all life forms, from bacteria to buffalo. Nitrogen is virtually absent from rocks, but very abundant in the atmosphere. In fact, it's 78% of the air we breathe. but atmospheric nitrogen is not in a form accessible to any organisms except for a few experts, the highly specialized nitrogen-fixing microbes in the soil and the sea. Volk estimates that the global biological cycling ratio of nitrogen is more than 1,000. That is, the average atom of nitrogen is exchanged between organisms 1,000 times before exiting the biosphere. But we have radically disrupted the nitrogen dance by radically increasing the bioavailability of nitrogen to the biosphere through overuse of chemical fertilizers. When organisms do have access to abundant nitrogen, they just cannot control themselves. They gorge on it, and then in decomposing, suck the oxygen out of the water, which in turn kills other life forms and leads to more anoxic waters. And this is what has created the growing dead zones in the oceans, the Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, the Baltic Sea, and elsewhere around the world, threatening the global marine food chain. Over geologic time, biogeochemical cycles evolved to be exquisitely balanced, elegantly choreographed, with all participants moving in stately synchrony. Our oafish alterations to them are something like driving a tank into the contra dance. Of course, the big elephant or element in the room is carbon, namely our non-looping, uncompensated one-way injection of it as CO2, especially into the atmosphere. For hundreds of millions of years, tiny carbonate-secreting organisms like these coccolithophores, and there's a scale bar, a tiny, they're very small, less than a human hair in width, have converted atmospheric carbon dioxide exhaled by volcanoes into mineral form, thereby keeping Earth from becoming a runaway greenhouse planet. They've locked it away as limestone. But now, human emissions of carbon dioxide outstrip those by volcanoes by a factor of more than 50. And in fact, the person who figured that out is in this room, Terry Gerlach. And that's far too fast for the biosphere to keep up with. An unjust fact about carbon emissions is that while one part of the world, the US and Western Europe, has been responsible for a disproportionate share of the carbon dioxide output over the past century, the whole world suffers the consequences. This is because the mixing time of the troposphere, the lower atmosphere where we live, the time it takes for turbulence stirring by winds and weather to homogenize the air on a global scale is relatively short, about a year, compared with the residence time of carbon in the atmosphere, which is about 100 years. If the mixing time were long compared with the residence time, then CO2 would hover close to the places where it's released, like garbage piling up when trash haulers strike, and might motivate action to emit less. But because our individual emissions are not only invisible, but conveniently dispersed around the world, we have little incentive to curtail them. We've been living like the louche protagonist in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, who in spite of a reckless, narcissistic lifestyle of gluttony and drunkenness, as well as cruel and immoral behavior, mysteriously remains youthful and handsome for decades. In the end, his dark secret is revealed. For years, a portrait of him he kept locked in the attic has accumulated the effects of his debauchery, and when it is brought into the light, the full horror of his contemptible lifestyle is revealed. We are now getting to that point of horrible revelation with carbon emissions. It's sobering to note that all of the great mass extinction events of the geologic past have been linked with severe disturbances to the carbon and other biogeochemical cycles. Even the dinosaur extinction event, which of course is linked with a meteorite impact, was ultimately caused by the ensuing upheavals in the chemistry of the ocean and atmosphere. And the bedrock story of the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history, the end Permian cataclysm, tells how a thriving global biosphere was nearly dealt a mortal blow by the combined effects of abrupt volcanically induced greenhouse warming, ocean acidification, and widespread marine anoxia, a scenario chillingly familiar to Anthropocene listeners. So this has been only one glimpse of the trove of wise principles and cautionary tales from the rock record. For me, knowing the long story arc of the Earth enchants the world and enriches my experience of being alive in it now by establishing a sense of kinship with other humans and with all denizens of the planet, past, present, and future. But this polytemporal perspective is at odds with our long-cherished belief that we humans are exceptional, and with the more recent conviction that our time is somehow utterly disjunct and set apart from all previous eras. In his contemplation of the paradoxes of modernity, the French philosopher Bruno Latour has observed, "We moderns have a peculiar propensity for understanding time that passes, as if it were really abolishing the past behind it. In the last decade, this feeling of estrangement from the past has been amplified by the embrace of disruption as an intrinsically good and necessary thing in commerce and culture. We admire those who move fast and break things. But this view of time as a scorched earth kind of process is an epistemic rupture with the past, not to mention a dangerous delusion that leads to a variety of ills ranging from personal narcissism to technological hubris. Earlier civilizations had different and arguably more sophisticated perceptions of time. In most pre-modern cultures, the past hovered over the present. Ancestors were felt to be watching. Past and future generations were understood to be knitted into one fabric. The medieval Scandinavian worldview included the concept of virt, loosely fate, or the power of the past to shape the present. In Ghanaian tradition, there is the concept of Sankofa, symbolized by a backward-looking bird and associated with the proverb, "It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten." In other words, move forward, but remember the past. And there is the Buddhist concept of sati, which is usually translated as mindfulness, but is actually apparently something closer to memory of the present, suggesting a subtler relationship with time. In these traditions and many others, the past, present, and future coexist and interact in ways much more nuanced than our simplistic linear view of time. In our culture, we tend to mistake technological prowess for wisdom. The people we call visionaries base their conceptions of the future on the notion that we should do everything in our power to circumvent the irksome constraints of the natural world, not appreciating that Earth is so much more powerful and far more patient than we will ever be and will always prevail. The idea that Earth time just doesn't apply to us leads to the delusion that, for example, we could outsmart the complex system of biogeochemical cycles and magically solve our climate woes by altering the chemistry of the upper atmosphere with sulfate injection and expect that there won't be a powerful backlash of unintended consequences as the contradancers reorganize themselves at a planetary scale. Disrespect for time also seduces us into thinking that we could skip over all that inefficient millions of years of coevolution stuff and just terraform ourselves another planet. Engineering the climate or terraforming Mars sound easy if you are completely unaware of the intrinsic timescales of geological and biological phenomena, the deep evolutionary pathways that gave rise to the world we live in, the intricately choreographed behind-the-scenes biogeochemical cycles, the housekeeping crew that make Earth habitable. Such ideas are beyond hubris, revealing not only a profound ignorance of the Earth, but also of human nature. What makes us think we could successfully change the rules that govern this or another planet when we haven't even learned to govern ourselves? Anthropologist Clifford Geertz famously defined culture as the constellation of stories that groups of humans tell about themselves and their place and purpose in the world. In Western culture, with its Judeo-Christian underpinnings grafted to principles of social democracy and capitalism, the stories we share about who we are largely exclude the natural world. Nature is at most a passive backdrop, the scenery against which the real stories unfold, not a central protagonist in the narrative. Well, very soon now, the scenery is going to start directing the play. Long-term thinking is absolutely essential to grappling with the intractable issues of our time: climate change, intergenerational poverty. Yet just when the need for that is most acute, our attention spans are shrinking. Our political and economic infrastructure has few mechanisms for sustained action over the timescales needed to resolve our most stubborn problems. Government is increasingly hamstrung by the 2-year congressional cycle. Corporate decision-making is yoked to shareholders' demands for consistently positive annual returns. As individuals, we hardly have time to look up from our beloved phones. Meanwhile, our leaders embrace anti-scientific magical thinking that makes medieval worldviews like the idea of Virt seem positively enlightened. Increasingly, the only institutions that can act on intergenerational timescales are authoritarian governments or foundations underwritten by the super wealthy. And while the actions of many of these organizations may be laudable, they are also fundamentally undemocratic. We need to democratize the future. When we peer into the geologic future, a paradox emerges. To some extent, we can see what lies in the far distance more clearly than what is in the foreground. The Sun, as a G-type star, is about halfway through its life expectancy, and in 5 billion years or so will enter its red giant phase, engulfing the Earth and other inner planets. 3 billion years before that, however, the Sun's increasing luminosity will lead to an extreme greenhouse effect from the vaporization of the Earth's oceans. For at least the next billion years or so, plate tectonics will continue to shuttle continents to new positions on the globe. The Atlantic Ocean will begin to close, and in about 250 million years, the Americas will be reunited with Europe and Asia in a new supercontinent that's already been named Pangaea Ultima. Meanwhile, rivers will have erased the Himalaya, Alps, and Rockies. In about 80,000 years, the Earth will reach the point in its orbital cycles where another ice age could happen, but this will depend on greenhouse gas concentrations, ocean circulation, the state of the biosphere, and many other variables. The next 1,000 years, the same amount of time that separates us from the Viking Age, are even harder to bring into focus. If human carbon emissions have not been sharply curbed and powerful positive feedbacks in the climate system are activated, the Earth could experience a replay of a climate catastrophe called the Pliocene-Eocene thermal maximum 55 million years ago. Temperatures would spike by more than 10 degrees. Marine and land-based ecosystems would be stressed to the point of collapse. Sea level would rise tens or more feet, inundating many of the world's most populous cities. Altered weather patterns, more ferocious storms, longer and deeper droughts would stress world food production. Increasing proportions of government budgets would have to be channeled into crisis management. The balance of geopolitical power would shift depending on how nations fare in the new climate regime. But none of this is preordained. We have the power to write a different saga for the coming millennium. Rather than lapse into existential despair that we won't be here in a billion years, let us reclaim at least the next few centuries. So in these dark days, let us imagine what an Earth-literate, timeful society might look like. In his last public interview, Kurt Vonnegut said, "I'll tell you, one thing that no cabinet has ever had is a secretary of the future. And there are no plans at all for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. So let us adopt Vonnegut's suggestion as our first proposal. A representative for the yet-to-be-born to serve among the top advisors to the president. The Department of the Future would set in motion a realignment of priorities in all aspects of society." And here I feel like we should have some triumphant music building gradually in the background, so imagine that. The secretary will declare some new national holidays: Chief Seattle, Aldo Leopold, and Rachel Carson Days to honor great long-term thinkers. Photosynthesis and Carbonate Rock Week, a time to celebrate the mighty legions of coccolithophores and others who kept the planet from becoming a hellish greenhouse. Resource conservation would become a core value and patriotic virtue again. Tax incentives and subsidies would be rebalanced to reward long-term stewardship over short-term exploitation. Putting a price on carbon might help us get a grip on our fossil fuel addiction, sober up, and let us prepare for natural disasters that will happen without our assistance, like the hundreds of large earthquakes that will happen around the globe in the next century, rather than spend resources on self-created climate catastrophes. Poverty and class-based disparity of opportunity would be recognized as problems with deep historical roots that cannot be solved without sustained commitment over commensurate timescales into the future. Public school teachers and others whose work represents an investment in the future would be paid well and held in high esteem. Geology would be fully integrated into science curricula, perhaps serving as a capstone course in which students would apply concepts of physics, chemistry, and biology to the immensely complex Earth system. With a solid understanding of how the planet works, students would go on to become educated voters who would hold public officials accountable for wise governance of air, land, and water. Legislators, governors, and mayors who embrace the 7 generations principle would point proudly to what they're working toward and be re-elected by grateful constituents. In such a society, all citizens, starting from an early age, would develop an understanding and respect for natural history and a lifelong curiosity to learn more. The dramatic narratives of the geologic past are, after all, perfectly suited to the human appetite for storytelling. Like many who experienced childhood or parenthood in the last 50 years, I love Maurice Sendak Where the Wild Things Are, about the power of imagination to take us to other worlds, transcend time, and save us from our worst selves. I think of Max's Voyage whenever I teach History of Earth and Life, a course in which we cover Earth's 4.5 billion year history in a 10-week term for an average clip of about, 4 150 million years a week. I'm not sure what happened there. I always feel I've been on a long journey with my students. We've witnessed alien Earths, explored alternate ecosystems. I think my power cord fell off. Sorry. So I think of Max's Voyage. We've witnessed alien Earths, explored alternate ecosystems, teeming with strange wild things, seen bountiful times and bad ones. It's not really critical, you can see this. Finally, we approach the present and see the modern world emerging from the mists, just as Max's room gradually sheds its vines and becomes recognizable. I believe, perhaps naively, that if more people could experience this journey and see themselves as Earthlings with a common past and shared destiny, it might spring us out of the polarized and entrenched ways of thinking about the world. As a geologist, I've worked with people from all over the world, from very different cultures and generations older and younger than mine. The strong human connections I've developed with them through our shared study of the Earth makes me optimistic that this geocentric worldview might help us overcome the animosities and barriers that divide us and get down to work on things that really matter. Collective awareness of Earth's story might save us from environmental hubris. Understanding how historical happenstance is written into each of our personal lives might cause us to treat each other with more empathy. As Darwin wrote in the last page of Origin of Species, in a sentence, I'll warn you, with many commas and a semicolon, there is grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. That grandeur has always included us. We've simply tormented ourselves with the idea that we are outside the garden. As a technological society, we have an almost autistic relationship with the Earth. We are rigid in our habits, savants when it comes to certain narrow obsessions, but dysfunctional in many other regards because we wrongly view ourselves as alone in the cosmos. Believing that nature is something outside us, a mute and immutable thing external to us, we are unable to empathize or communicate with it. But the Earth is whispering in our ears all the time. In every stone, it offers an eternal truth or good rule of thumb. In every leaf, a prototype power station. In every ecosystem, a model of good urban planning. In every biogeochemical cycle, a template for a healthy global economy. We need to view ourselves as citizens of the Earth, this still evolving tangle of old, recycled, sun-powered, and profoundly interdependent dancing parts. There is comfort to be found in the knowledge that we live on a very old, durable planet, not an immature, untested, and possibly fragile one. Our daily experiences as Earthlings can be enriched by an awareness of the lingering presence of so many previous versions and citizens of this place. There's a teaching attributed to the 18th century Polish rabbi Simcha Bunim that for me, a lapsed, indeed agnostic Scandinavian Lutheran, carries great wisdom. It goes like this. One should always carry 2 slips of paper, one in your left pocket that reads, "I am ashes and dust," one in the right that says, "The world was made for me." Both are true. But our Holocene snow day is ending very soon, and no one is going to be waiting for us with a warm supper. It's time to grow up, and with a clear-eyed view of both past and future, resolve to become better ancestors and start making up for so much lost time. Thank you. I went a little over, but
We're doing fine with time. We would like to pass the mic around so we can record your questions and comments. Somebody way in the back yet there.
So I'll just speak loudly. I've heard 2 comments about climate change in the last 2 months. One I won't even ask you to address. It had something to do with the force of a rocket launches in Florida is tilting the Earth, therefore we have climate change. The second one, though, was spoken by I think a senator from Wisconsin last week, or he was on a radio show, and it was about climate change, and Tony Evers has put together a climate panel, and he's sort of skeptical of whether they'll come up with anything useful, but in his rebuttal, he said, well, as a former weatherman and meteorologist, the Earth has gone through these cycles before, and we just don't know that what we're currently going through isn't just natural phenomenon. And so how would you respond if he was in front of you saying that right now? What would you say to him to say, yes, it has, but?
Right, so we actually have quite high resolution climate records that we can read from ice cores. I'm sure people are familiar with that idea. We have a really good handle on how climate has changed in the past, and yes, Earth's climate is complicated and it has changed profoundly in the geologic past, but not since modern humans emerged. The last 10,000 years, we call it the Holocene, that's human history, has been a remarkably stable time, and even small deviations from sort of the average have led to famine, war, and other things. We are not as flexible as we like to think. So these changes of the geologic past happened for complicated reasons, but the amplitude is not something that we have seen in our own time. And it's just not true that we don't understand past changes and how modern changes in especially greenhouse gas concentrations are radically different. The rates of change are the other really alarming thing that alarm most of the geoscientists. We have to look quite a ways back in the geologic record to see anything like recent rates of increase of greenhouse gas concentrations.
Thank you.
Any questions around this slide? She'll give you.
Well, as an Earth geologist, do you see any positive developments in the study of what happened to, say, other planets like Mars as a lesson? I guess I'm very intrigued by the fact that the Earth, in my poor understanding of geology, has been able to heal itself over the course of many of these catastrophes, but Mars has not, for instance. And is there some tipping point to our own planet where it can't be healed?
Great questions, and yes, the insights that we've gained about Mars and also Venus, which are our sort of brother and sister planets, have made us realize how different Earth's early evolution especially was from its neighbors in space. Earth has been through a lot. There have been 5 mass extinction events in the last 500 million years. Obviously, life has never been completely extinguished. It takes often millions of years to recover, but life has always come back. The climate system, although it's gone through upheavals, has in the main always been fairly clement for life. We've never, for probably 3.8 billion years, been outside the envelope of temperatures where liquid water couldn't exist. So it is a remarkable thing, and it really is all wrapped up with these biogeochemical cycles that I was talking about. I don't think that what we're doing in the Anthropocene is going to push Earth itself to some kind of breaking point. It's our own skins we need to be worried about. Earth is probably going to be fine, but I am not so callous as to say, well, let's just do it then, because the tragedy is that the actions of a small fraction of the Earth's human population are going to affect the poorest people in the world the most. And that's a very inhumane thing. So, yeah, I'm not worried about the planet. We can take a lot of other species and ecosystems down with us, but I think in the long range, microbes will survive, and they'll reinvent another version of the world.
Other questions?
You have a thought on the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord?
What can I say? I mean, it's just a big step backwards, and I'm hopeful that the collective will see the right thing to do in a few years.
You suggested
that life was never totally wiped out with all these events in history? We never started over at any point?
Well, that's a good question. So the earliest indirect evidence of life goes way back to 3.8 billion years, and we think that it was microbial life. And if we look at all the microbes in the world today, and we've only sequenced a tiny fraction of them, they all have basically the same genetic apparatus, which is DNA. So all creatures on Earth have the same basic way of replicating. And so that's strong evidence that we're all related to each other. So either life got started and wiped out, and we have no record of those earlier attempts, or it got started once and stuck, and it's still with us today.
Just a follow-up on your, and comment on your, I'm over here, on your comment about how we've sort of lost touch with the natural world. There's a professor at the University of Notre Dame who I read about recently who teaches American Studies. And at the end of his year, his senior class, which is usually numbering fewer than 100 students, he asks them the same question. When you leave from here in the university setting, where would you like to live? It's a simple question. And almost 80 to 90% of them will say things like, in the Rocky Mountains, on a lake shore, near a river, overlooking the ocean, whatever. So he's been doing this for a good number of years. And he then tracked those students and asked them to comment back. And he has found that almost all of them, after a short time, live in an urban area. So it's a very romantic idea, but his comment, and the reason he brought that up is because it seems to be an ingrained thing that we have as Americans, that somehow when we're young, we're going to live in those idyllic, romantic places, but unfortunately or realistically, that rarely happens.
That's true. I mean, people have to have jobs to support themselves. But there's nature everywhere. Nature isn't only in national parks, and I think that's part of our illusion that the built environment looms so large in our minds that we don't think of ourselves as being earthlings and learning how the planet works. But
Anyone else with a question?
It seems to me that one of the things that I'm sorry, she just it seems to me that one of the things that might be useful is to link geology with the study of anthropology and looking at how there have been human civilizations that have gone extinct because either they've been so stressed or they had, there's been disease or there's been famine, especially if they're island populations. And likewise, other species that have gone extinct because of over-aggressive behaviors. They've eaten themselves out of house and home, so to speak. And so while the Earth may continue, will likely continue without us, it is possible for us to go extinct. And is that something we want for the future?
And you're right. There is an emerging kind of interdisciplinary study of big history. So it includes history as we normally think about it, but over maybe century sort of timescales, and looking at the role of changes in ecosystems and climate and how they've influenced things like the 100 Years' War in Europe. People think of it, well, it's all kinds of complicated political things. Well, if you look also, there were environmental stresses that were causing famine, and these things undermine stability. And I think that sort of slow, inexorable descent into harder times is hard to get people motivated to react to, and that's what's happening to us now. If you look at the fires in California, these are harbingers of things to come, but sometimes people think there's going to be some great conflagration or cataclysm. It's not going to be like that. It's just going to be a slow grind. Quality of life will be eroded, more and more resources put into mopping up after this sort of thing, and little by little we have less autonomy about how we're using the money that we do have. So we urgently need this kind of thinking and to expose people to this new kind of history that includes human and environmental history in one thing. I agree. Question?
He's getting the mic out.
Okay.
Just inject a quick thought building on it.
Okay, I just want to ask, to me, as I listen and watch your program, and listen and watch what's going on in the majority of the, I would say a lot of the world, populated areas, civilized areas, it seems like we have a death wish. And really, when I look at how we are destroying, and very selfish. So that's my comment.
Yeah, I just think people, it's, okay, I have lots of thoughts about this. Geologists are frustrated because most of the news we have to convey to people is bad news, and so of course that's not something people want to hear. If it requires change in lifestyles, that's a difficult thing. The one thing that really could leverage change now is a carbon tax. And I don't know if you have a citizens climate lobby group in it, Wapaka?
Yes, we do.
I'm not surprised, good. And that's a great organization to get involved with. They, I think, are making headway, and major corporations are planning on this. Oil companies are kind of counting on the idea this is going to happen. And actually, in answer to your question about what would I tell our senator, check in with insurance companies. They are smart. They know what's going to happen. Have you checked in on coastal insurance rates lately? That's, corporate America knows what's going on, and I trust that eventually the rest of us will catch up.
We have a question here.
Right here.
You've touched on it. In fact, you kind of just now. Talking about closer. Okay. The economics. Is capitalism, consumerism fundamentally incompatible with environmentalism? And what kind of changes would be necessary to have a realistic, positive outlook?
Well, I don't think that capitalism is fundamentally in opposition to living sustainably, but we need to, it's not going to be laissez-faire capitalism. We need to rebalance subsidies and tax structures to incentivize environmentally responsible behavior. Certainly, population growth is another part of it. But the fact is that a tiny fraction of the world's population is disproportionately responsible for most of the environmental degradation. So it's not just population, it's also the way the most affluent live. So if we're going to have a capitalist society and have one that's sustainable over the long term, we have to grow up and create the economic incentives. That's the only lever that is powerful enough to change behavior, to do the right thing. And I think that a carbon tax of some kind, we have smart economists out there, can figure out a way to make it not an incredibly regressive tax. And it probably should be incrementally introduced soon, but incremental, so it's not a huge jar to the economy. But we have to, again, be the adults and start taking responsibility.
We have a question over here.
Do organized geologists, the geological societies, whatever, have any kind of plan for getting into the K-12 educational system so that we don't first run into geology as an elective in university?
There are many outreach strategies that the various professional societies have, but it's almost as difficult to change curricula in schools as it is to change our carbon habits. It's incredibly difficult. And it's just, sort of a historical artifact. Geology was not a particularly rigorous discipline in the early 20th century when science curricula, as we know them today, got established in our schools. And it's just an artifact of that time. And it's really ridiculous that Earthlings never really are exposed to the way their planet works.
Well, the social sciences have the same problem, but they're in our schools.
Yeah, I don't know.
I would like to make a comment. When I went to UW La Crosse, I had to choose electives for science credit, and I chose geology. And I'm 70 years old, and I still am fascinated by geology. So I think that if younger people were exposed to it, they would be fascinated. They would love it. It is so interesting.
And that's my experience. I mean, sadly, many of our students come into the classrooms, they're a little science phobic even, and avoiding physics or chemistry. And they take geology, and so a world opens to them, but often they're taking it as juniors or seniors. It's too late. So, yeah. A couple more, and then we probably need to.
Is this thing on? Okay. In view of all the existential problems we face, and you mentioned a lot of them, climate change and there's any number, but today what you see is people like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, talking about going to terraform Mars or living on the moon without even recognizing the problems that would entail. You'd have to take everything with you, and it certainly is not going to help all the 7.7 billion people. The 7.7 billion people who live on the world today. It is just so far-fetched, and I kind of wondered whether you any comment on that. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just kind of crazy.
Oh, it is, and I actually had an interesting personal experience this summer. I did a talk for Stuart Brand's Long Now Foundation out in San Francisco. So Stuart Brand had the Polar's catalog back in the 60s and 70s. He's still around, and he's now got this foundation. It is about long-term thinking. So he wasn't there. He was actually at James Lovelock's 100th birthday, if you know who James Lovelock is. But others were there, including a few people who are close colleagues of Bezos, the guy who founded Wired magazine, and they took me out to dinner afterwards. And they were talking about all their terraforming strategies. I was like, first of all, I was kind of insulted. Did you not hear my talk? And secondly, I honestly had this rising sense of panic that I was surrounded by insane people. You know, they are incredibly powerful people who are completely mad.
Just one other point.